The autumn mist had settled thick and low over Baker Street that morning, dulling the outlines of hansom cabs and blurring the silhouettes of passers-by. I had taken my accustomed seat by the fire, a newspaper folded across my knee, when Holmes looked up suddenly from the correspondence strewn upon the table before him. He held a thin strip of yellow paper between two fingers, its edges curled from the hurried scrawl pressed upon it. A curious summons. "Watson," he remarked, tapping the telegram as though to quicken its secrets. "From Denver, Colorado, of all places. The matter bears urgency, and it would seem our presence is requested on the far side of the Atlantic." "Denver?" I echoed, laying aside the paper. "Surely you cannot be serious, Holmes. What earthly concern could a detective of London have with affairs in the American frontier?" He leaned back, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin. His eyes, sharp as the point of a blade, gleamed with that particular light I had come to recognize, the glimmer that preceded adventure. "The sender is one Clara Pierce," he explained. "Her brother Jonathan Pierce, heir to a considerable mining fortune, has vanished. She writes that the local authorities are inclined to dismiss the matter as some youthful escapade, yet she is convinced, and I must agree upon the brief evidence presented here, that foul play is involved." I could not help but smile at the inevitability of it. "And I presume you mean to cross the ocean at once?" "Quite so. The case possesses certain peculiarities which stir my interest. The young man was last seen in company with a stranger of distinctly English origin. A scar across his face," she writes, in a manner both secretive and urgent. "Why should a Londoner concern himself with the disappearance of a Denver heir? Unless, of course, the matter is rooted in something beyond mere provincial crime." Holmes rose, pacing the room with his habitual restlessness. He paused at the mantel, gazing into the flames. "It is often my observation, Watson, that crime knows little of borders. The seeds planted in one land may well flower in another, and the Atlantic is no barrier to a mind bent upon mischief." The notion of venturing so far stirred in me both curiosity and unease. My experiences with Holmes had led me into perilous alleys of London, across moors haunted by dread, and into dens of thieves hidden behind the most respectable facades. Yet America, the thought carried with it a sense of the unknown, of wide landscapes and rough justice. Holmes, as though divining my thoughts, smiled faintly. "You hesitate, my dear fellow. But consider, when has routine ever brought satisfaction to your pen or to my faculties? This telegram is nothing less than a call to arms. Will you not answer it with me?" And so, by that very evening, preparations were in motion. Within 2 days we were aboard the steamship Aurora, its mighty engines churning the gray waters of the Atlantic. Holmes spent much of the voyage stretched upon a deck chair, his keen eyes half closed, his mind weaving patterns invisible to any but himself. At times he spoke little for hours, and at others he would spring to life with sudden questions about the workings of American law, the scale of the mining industry, or the habits of frontier men. I amused myself with novels, with observations of the varied passengers, and with my own reflections upon what awaited us. The sister's plea echoed in my mind. "He is my only brother, Mr. Holmes. Find him, or I fear I shall never know peace." There was in her words a desperation that no mere prank or youthful wanderlust could explain. After 10 days' journey, the peaks of the Rockies rose faint upon the horizon, and soon we reached the bustling city of Denver, a place unlike any I had seen. It bore the energy of London's commerce, yet with a ruggedness that spoke of its frontier roots. Streets rang with the hammering of industry, with the shouts of prospectors, and with the rattle of wagons heavy with ore. At the Pierce residence, a grand house of stone standing aloof from the dusty bustle, we were received at once. Clara Pierce was a woman of striking composure, though grief and sleepless nights had left their mark upon her countenance. She led us to a drawing room lined with books and shaded against the fierce mountain sun. "My brother vanished 5 nights ago," she said, her hands clasped tightly before her. "He was last seen leaving his hotel, intending to call upon an acquaintance. Since then, nothing. The police assure me he has likely taken himself off on some pleasure excursion, as young men are apt to do. But Jonathan is not of that sort, Mr. Holmes. He was earnest, dedicated to his work, and loyal to our family's concerns. He would never leave without word." Holmes inclined his head. "Your telegram mentioned a scar-faced Englishman." "Yes, several witnesses confirm it. A tall man with a deep scar running from temple to jaw. Jonathan spoke with him on more than one occasion." I do not know his name, but his presence unsettled my brother. I implored Jonathan to confide in me, but he insisted it was nothing. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Did he leave behind any letters, papers, or notes of a suspicious nature? She hesitated, then drew from a small desk a folded sheet of paper. This was found among his things. I cannot make sense of it. Holmes spread the paper carefully. Across it were written several odd phrases, apparently random, but in Holmes's mind they aligned into unseen order. I saw the faint curve of satisfaction touch his lips. "A cipher, Watson," he murmured. Not elaborate, but cunning enough to conceal meaning from casual eyes. "The presence of such a document confirms my suspicion. Your brother stumbled upon matters of gravity, Miss Pierce, and for that very reason he was silenced." Clara's eyes filled, though she strove for composure. "Then you believe he yet lives?" "I cannot say. But I assure you we shall leave no stone unturned." And so with little rest, Holmes set forth upon his inquiries. We traced Jonathan's final steps to a hotel on Larimer Street. The clerk recalled him distinctly, noting his polite manner and his evident preoccupation. From there he was seen at a saloon of less reputable character, in the company of the scar-faced stranger. The bartender described the man as English, his accent plain to the ear, his demeanor tense. Holmes examined the saloon with his customary thoroughness, noting the placement of chairs, the smudge of ash upon a windowsill, and the faint scent of tobacco lingering in the air. "South American," he declared softly, rubbing a pinch of ash between his fingers. "A variety rarely imported here. Whoever our scar-faced friend is, he carries with him habits not native to Colorado." That night in our lodging, Holmes spread before him the cipher once more, working by lamplight while I sat nearby. His fingers moved rapidly, his pencil scratching upon scrap paper. At last he leaned back, his face alight with triumph. "The message concerns mining claims," he said. "Fraudulent, I dare say. Young Pierce had stumbled upon evidence of deceit, likely the manipulation of titles, the falsification of yields. Such matters could ruin fortunes and expose powerful men. And this scar-faced Englishman?" I asked. Holmes's expression darkened. "The cipher bears traces of phrasing I have seen before. Peculiar, distinctly British. I fear, Watson, that we are not dealing merely with local rogues, but with agents whose designs stretch across continents." The lamplight flickered, shadows stretching across the room as though echoing his words. Outside, the wind swept down from the mountains, carrying with it a chill that seemed to whisper of dangers yet unseen. Clara's plea rang again in my ears, and I knew our task had only begun. Holmes folded the papers neatly, his eyes never leaving the dark window. "The game, my dear Watson, is not merely afoot, it is abroad." Holmes was up at dawn the next morning, already bent over his notes as the first pale light slipped through the curtains. The paper bearing Jonathan Pierce's cipher lay unfolded before him, its strange phrases now surrounded by Holmes's annotations in neat, sharp script. He glanced up only briefly when I stirred from sleep. "Watson," he said, in that brisk tone which never failed to summon my full attention, "the solution to this mystery lies as much in the streets of Denver as in the mountains beyond. We must tread both paths, and quickly, if we are to intercept our quarry before he slips entirely beyond our reach." The city outside was already alive when we stepped into the street. Wagons creaked beneath loads of ore, their wheels sending up clouds of dust. Shopkeepers raised awnings against the climbing sun. Miners with blackened hands and grim faces poured into saloons for an early draft. The atmosphere was one of ceaseless motion, and yet it carried a tension I could not at first define, a sense that in these growing streets, wealth and ruin brushed elbows with equal ease. Holmes, however, seemed to absorb the scene with delight. His gaze darted from the lines of new brick buildings to the ragged tents pitched on the outskirts, to the men who strode past with revolvers at their belts. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "how swiftly civilization attempts to impose itself upon raw opportunity. In such soil, corruption flourishes as easily as gold is mined." Our first call was at the office of the Denver police, a modest building crowded with clerks and constables. The officer in charge, a stout man with a florid face, received us with the cordial impatience of one who has little faith in outsiders meddling in his affairs. "Mr. Pierce has likely gone off to the mountains with friends," he declared. "Young fellows often do. We've no cause to stir up alarm." Holmes regarded him coolly. "And yet, sir, the testimony of multiple witnesses confirms his last company was a stranger of dubious aspect. You have not deemed it necessary to identify this individual? The officer shrugged. Denver sees men from every corner of the world. We can't be chasing after every scar-faced drifter. Holmes's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. Then allow me to relieve you of that burden. Come, Watson. We must place our trust in more attentive eyes. Outside, we hailed a cab and directed the driver to Larimer Street, where Jonathan had last been observed. The area bore all the signs of disrepute. Narrow alleys hung with smoke, the reek of stale beer and sweat, voices raised in quarrel behind swinging doors. The saloon where Pierce had been seen stood with its shutters half open, its faded sign creaking above. Inside, the air was close and thick with smoke. Holmes strode directly to the counter and fixed the bartender with a gaze so piercing that the man's words faltered before they began. You recall the Englishman with the scar? Holmes said quietly. He drank here 5 nights ago with Mr. Jonathan Pierce. What did they discuss? The bartender shifted uneasily, polishing a glass with exaggerated care. I don't pry into gentlemen's conversations, nor need you, Holmes replied. The ash upon your sill, the brand of tobacco scarcely obtainable in these parts, tells me the stranger left behind more than coin. Yet your hesitation suggests you know more than you admit. Speak plainly, and you shall have no trouble from me. The man hesitated, then lowered his voice. They spoke in whispers, but I caught enough. Something about papers, about proof that could ruin men high up. The Englishman kept glancing at the door, nervous-like. When they left, I saw another fellow shadow them, though Mr. Pierce never seemed to notice. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And this other fellow, describe him. A big man, dark beard, wearing a miner's coat. Looked like he'd sooner break bones than talk business. Holmes thanked him curtly and led me outside. We are now certain, Watson. Pierce stumbled upon evidence of a conspiracy, mining claims fraudulent and dangerous. The scar-faced man was his contact, but whether ally or adversary remains to be seen. The bearded brute, however, I suspect to be a hired hand, sent to ensure Pierce did not leave with his knowledge intact. We spent the afternoon visiting the hotel where Pierce had stayed. His room, though tidied since his disappearance, yielded traces that escaped the eye of ordinary servants. Holmes found a smear of dust beneath the writing desk and from it extracted a fragment of torn stationery, bearing the faint watermark of a London firm. He studied it in silence for a long moment, then slipped it into his pocket. London, Watson, he murmured. The threads grow tighter. Whoever plots behind this affair is no provincial rogue. Their hand stretches across the ocean, and I dare say I shall soon recognize its grip. Clara Pierce received us again that evening, her expression marked by anxious hope. Holmes reported our findings with the measured calm that so often steadied others even in the darkest uncertainty. Your brother's disappearance is no accident, Miss Pierce. He was drawn into a matter of grave consequence, one that reaches beyond Denver. Rest assured we are closing upon the truth. But I must ask you, did your brother have correspondents in London? Associates beyond those here in Colorado? She thought carefully. There was one gentleman, a Mr. Henry Blackwood, a financier. Jonathan met him in London last spring. They discussed investments, though my brother seemed troubled after their dealings. I pressed him, but he said little. Holmes inclined his head, a spark in his eyes. Blackwood. The name is not unknown to me. A man of bold schemes and few scruples. It would be most instructive to learn whether he is presently in America. When she had withdrawn, Holmes turned to me with the gravity that heralded dangerous work ahead. We must proceed with caution. The men we pursue will not scruple to silence us, should we tread too near their secrets. Denver may appear a thriving city of trade, yet beneath its respectable surface lies a network as tangled as any London underworld. The following days were consumed with investigation. Holmes, relentless as ever, spoke with prospectors cheated of claims, with clerks who hinted of altered documents, and with merchants who had seen English gold pass through local hands. Each fragment of testimony added to the picture he was constructing. One evening, as we returned along the dim-lit street, a sudden shout rang out. A shadow detached itself from an alley, and a heavy form lunged toward Holmes with a gleam of steel in hand. Instinct carried me forward, but Holmes, ever swift, sidestepped with feline grace. The attacker's knife struck only air. Before he could recover, I seized his arm, and between us we wrenched the weapon free. The man was broad-shouldered, bearded, his eyes wild with fury, the very same description given by the bartender. Under questioning, however, he clamped his mouth shut, snarling only that we should keep out of matters beyond us. Holmes studied him with cold detachment. "Your silence condemns you more surely than your words could, my man. Still, we shall deliver you to the authorities. Perhaps their persuasion will loosen your tongue." Yet when the constables took him into custody, Holmes whispered to me, "Mark my words, Watson. He will not remain in their cells long. Men of this sort have protectors who value them too dearly. We must not rely on the law here. It is too easily swayed." That night, as the lamps flickered in our lodging, Holmes spread his notes across the table once more. His lean figure bent low, his eyes alight with the fire of pursuit. "We have touched the edges of their scheme, Watson. Fraudulent claims, stolen fortunes, and an English hand guiding it all. Jonathan Pierce was caught in the middle, and for that he was taken. Our next step must be the mountains. There, I am convinced, they hold him, or at least the evidence that will lead us to him." The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and in that moment I felt the vast presence of the Rockies pressing close around the city. Somewhere in those dark ranges lay the fate of the missing heir, and perhaps, if Holmes's instincts proved true, the shadow of a foe who had pursued us across oceans. Holmes extinguished the lamp, his face momentarily illuminated by the fading glow. "Rest, Watson. Tomorrow we climb higher into this web, and when we pull the strands taut, we shall see at last the shape of the spider who waits at its center." The dawn broke cold and sharp, the mountains looming like silent sentinels above Denver, their peaks capped in pale gold by the rising sun. I found Holmes already awake, standing at the window with arms folded behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the jagged horizon. His silhouette was stark against the light, tall and immovable like a general surveying the field before a battle. When he turned, there was in his expression that peculiar mixture of restraint and intensity, which told me his mind had been ceaselessly occupied throughout the night. "We are drawing nearer, Watson," he said quietly, as though unwilling to disturb the hush of the early morning. "I can feel the net tightening. Our next step must be precise, for each movement now will either bring us to Jonathan Pierce or alert his captors of our pursuit. I cannot afford the latter." He gestured to the table where his notes lay spread, covered with his fine, angular handwriting. Among them were witness statements, fragments of cipher, the description of the scar-faced Englishman, and the torn scrap of London stationery. At the center of it all sat Clara Pierce's letter, her words a constant reminder of the human weight pressing upon us. Holmes's plan for the day was straightforward in its design, but I knew that with him simplicity often masked complexity. We were to retrace Jonathan's final known movements with greater precision, speaking again to those who had seen him in his last hours, for often a second question revealed what the first concealed. Holmes was never content with surface recollections. He burrowed into memory until he unearthed the detail that seemed insignificant to all others, but to him was the missing keystone. We began at the hotel. The clerk, a nervous young man with spectacles slipping constantly down his nose, repeated his recollections of Jonathan Pierce. Holmes pressed him with a series of brisk inquiries. What hour had Pierce departed? What papers had he carried? Did he speak to anyone on the way out? The clerk, growing flustered, admitted that Pierce had been met in the lobby by the scar-faced Englishman, who had waited for him with evident impatience. They spoke in low tones before leaving together. "You are certain of the man's origin?" Holmes asked. The clerk nodded. "His voice was strange, sir. Not American. He called Mr. Pierce lad in a way I've only heard in Englishmen. He paid for his room in English sovereigns as well, though only for a single night." Holmes's eyes flickered with satisfaction. "Good, that confirms our trail. The sovereigns, Watson, are more than payment, they are a mark. The reach of this plot extends well beyond these borders, and its purse is heavy enough to silence many tongues." From the hotel we made our way back to the saloon. Though Holmes had already examined it once, he returned with the same thoroughness as though seeing it anew. This time he moved slowly, measuring distances, crouching to study the scuffed floorboards where chairs had been dragged, running his finger along the dusty sill where the exotic tobacco had been smoked. At last he approached the corner table where the bartender swore Jonathan and the Englishman had sat. "Watson," he said softly, "note this indentation in the wood." A knife pressed point down and twirled in idle motion during conversation. "Observe how deep the marks are, cut one upon another. Our scar-faced acquaintance is not merely nervous, he is restless, dangerous, a man whose patience is ever at war with his temper." Such habits are telling. They mark him as surely as a signature. Holmes's deductions, drawn from scratches and ashes, never failed to astonish me. To my untrained eye, the table bore only the usual scars of use, yet to Holmes it spoke volumes of character and intent. We questioned several patrons who had been present that night. Most claimed to remember nothing useful, but a wiry prospector with a voice like gravel recalled seeing the two men leave, followed closely by the bearded giant. He added almost as an afterthought that Pierce seemed reluctant, even hesitant, while the Englishman urged him onward with a hand upon his shoulder. Reluctant, Holmes repeated later as we walked back into the sunlight. That is crucial, Watson. Pierce was not willingly swept along. He was pressed into it, coaxed or threatened. His path that evening was not of his own choosing. The city seemed to thrum with hidden energy as we made our way toward the outskirts. Holmes's restless stride betrayed his eagerness, though his expression remained composed. At a small telegraph office, he dispatched a coded message to London, inquiring about Henry Blackwood's current whereabouts and any associates he might have sent abroad. Then we took a carriage to the edge of Denver, where the roads dissolved into rough tracks leading toward the foothills. It was there, as the shadows lengthened, that we encountered a man who would alter the shape of our inquiry. He was a miner, broad-shouldered, his clothes thick with dust, and he hailed us with the easy manner of one accustomed to strangers. He had overheard our questions in the town and claimed to have seen a young gentleman matching Jonathan Pierce's description being led toward the mountains. 2 nights passed. Not bound for any mine, I know, he said. Too secretive, too cautious. They kept off the main track, heading into the pines. And the big feller with the beard was there. Same as you describe. Holmes questioned him keenly, pressing for every detail of direction and manner. And when at last the man departed, Holmes stood silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Watson, he said at last, our quarry has left the city. Pierce is hidden in the mountains. It is there we must follow, and quickly, for every hour increases the danger to his life. Yet we must proceed carefully. To march blindly into those ranges would be folly, for we know neither the strength of our opponents nor the full scope of their scheme. We require guides, provisions, and above all, discretion. That evening, Clara Pierce received the news with a mixture of dread and hope. She implored us to take every precaution and pressed into Holmes's hands a small locket belonging to her brother, asking that if nothing else, we might return it to her. Holmes accepted it gravely, promising that he would do all in his power to bring Jonathan back alive. As we left her, Holmes spoke quietly to me. The bearded ruffian was but the visible arm of their design. Behind him stands the scar-faced Englishman, and behind him again, I suspect, a greater power still. Perhaps this Blackwood himself. We are stepping into a web, Watson, and each thread leads us nearer to its center. The question is whether we shall reach Pierce before the spider grows aware of our presence. That night I found sleep elusive. The thought of a young man imprisoned somewhere in the dark wilderness haunted me, and the shadowy figures who held him seemed to grow larger in my imagination. Yet even in my unease, I found comfort in the calm assurance of Holmes's manner. He was never reckless, never hurried beyond calculation, and I knew that if any man could untangle this sinister mystery, it was he. The next morning, we prepared ourselves for the ascent into the mountains. Holmes moved with brisk efficiency, securing maps, hiring a local guide of trustworthy reputation, and assembling provisions. His mind was already racing ahead, anticipating the obstacles that would confront us. As we left the city behind, the air grew sharper. The pines closed in about us, and the rumble of the streets was replaced by the whisper of wind through branches. Yet even in the beauty of the wilderness, the sense of pursuit weighed heavily upon us. Holmes, riding ahead, glanced often at the track behind, his instincts alert to every sound. At one point he reined in his horse, dismounted, and crouched beside the trail. "See here, Watson," he murmured, pointing to a faint imprint in the earth. The mark of a boot, larger than average, and beside it the faint drag of a heel. The bearded man, heavy-footed. "These prints are fresh, within 2 days. We are on their path." I felt a surge of both exhilaration and dread. The chase had truly begun. Somewhere ahead, hidden among the crags and pines, lay the answer to the riddle that had carried us across the Atlantic, the fate of Jonathan Pierce, the identity of his captors, and the shadow of a conspiracy that reached from London to the farthest edge of the American frontier. Holmes rose, his eyes scanning the narrowing trail. "Steady now, Watson. The game draws closer, and with it the danger. We must tread lightly, for the eyes of our adversaries may already be upon us, and with that, we pressed deeper into the Rockies, the city fading behind us, the mystery of the Denver disappearance leading us ever higher into its hidden heart. The higher we climbed, the more the city of Denver seemed to shrink into memory, its noise and bustle fading behind us like some distant dream. The road narrowed into stony tracks that wound through dark forests of pine, and the scent of resin mixed with the thin, chill air of altitude. Our guide, a wiry fellow named Harris, led us steadily forward, his eyes sharp for signs invisible to mine. Holmes, for his part, was no less alert, pausing often to study impressions in the soil, the bent grass beside a stream, or a broken branch dangling where careless hands had brushed. Each detail, however slight, seemed to him a step closer to Jonathan Pierce. It was on the second day of our ascent that Holmes crouched suddenly beside a patch of soft earth. I dismounted and joined him, though my eye found little beyond the confused pattern of animal tracks. Holmes, however, brushed away loose soil with delicate precision, revealing beneath the overlay the unmistakable print of a boot. "Large, square-toed, heavy tread," he murmured, his face intent. "The bearded ruffian again. Note the depth of the impression, Watson. He carried weight, perhaps a man upon his back or bound beside him. And here, faint but visible, another print, smaller, finer, a gentleman's boot. Jonathan Pierce himself. These tracks are scarcely 3 days old. We are close upon them." The discovery lent urgency to our progress. Holmes pressed Harris to quicken the pace, though never recklessly, for the terrain grew treacherous with jagged outcrops and sudden drops concealed by underbrush. More than once our horses stumbled, and I was reminded of the grim isolation of these mountains. Should misfortune befall us, no aid would come swiftly. At night, by the fire's flickering glow, Holmes bent once more over his notes. He had taken to carrying Pierce's cipher always upon his person, unfolding it again and again as though each glance might yield some fresh clue. On one such evening, as the wind howled through the pines and sparks leapt skyward, he tapped a finger upon a phrase written in the cipher. Observe this repetition. Watson, the word load appearing thrice in contexts that seem otherwise disjointed. I believe Pierce stumbled upon evidence of a falsified strike. These men sought to inflate the value of barren claims by seeding them with stolen ore, or by fabricating records. Such fraud, if exposed, would ruin fortunes built upon deceit. Pierce, with his position and wealth, would have had both motive and means to expose them. Hence his disappearance. I listened with growing unease. Then his life is in grave peril, Holmes. If these men will kill to protect their scheme, we may be too late. Holmes's eyes flickered in the firelight, calm but unyielding. It is always a race against the hourglass, Watson. Yet I have learned never to surrender to despair while reason offers even a thread to grasp. And we have more than a thread. We have their trail. On the third day, as we wound higher into the mountains, Harris halted suddenly, raising a hand for silence. From beyond a ridge came the faint echo of voices, harsh, guttural, carried by the wind. We dismounted and crept forward on foot, careful not to disturb loose stones. Peering through the thick growth of pine, we caught sight of a rough clearing below. There, beside a cabin of crude logs, 2 men stood conversing in low tones. One was the bearded brute we had seen before, unmistakable in his size and bearing. The other was leaner, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, yet even from that distance I saw the pale line of a scar glint across his cheek when he lifted his head. Holmes's hand tightened upon my arm. "The scar-faced Englishman," he breathed. "At last." We crouched in silence, watching as they moved about the cabin. At one point, the bearded man disappeared inside and emerged moments later with a small bundle of firewood. Behind him, through the open door, I glimpsed the faintest movement, shadows shifting in the dim interior. My heart leapt. Could it be Pierce himself held captive within? Holmes motioned us back from the ridge, his expression grave. "We must not act rashly, Watson. To rush in would be folly. They are armed and likely not alone. We require certainty before we move. Tonight, when darkness is our ally, we shall approach closer." The hours that followed were long and taut with suspense. We withdrew to a sheltered hollow and waited as the sun sank behind the peaks, leaving the forest cloaked in shadow. The air grew bitterly cold, our breath rising in pale clouds. Yet Holmes remained still as stone, his eyes fixed upon the line of trees that concealed the cabin. When at last the darkness was complete, we crept forward. Holmes moved with astonishing silence, every step calculated, every pause attuned to the faintest sound. I followed as best I could, my nerves strung tight. From the edge of the clearing, we crouched once more. A lantern burned dimly within the cabin, casting narrow beams of light through the chinks in the walls. Holmes lowered himself to the ground, pressing his ear against the earth. After a moment, he whispered, "Only 2 men remain within, the scar-faced one and his bearded companion. If Pierce is held here, he lies bound in some inner room. We must confirm it." He gestured for Harris to circle wide and watch the trail, ensuring no others approached. Then, with a swiftness that left me breathless, Holmes slid forward through the underbrush until he reached the cabin wall. I followed, heart pounding. From a narrow crack between logs, Holmes peered inside. I did the same, and what I saw etched itself upon my memory. Jonathan Pierce lay upon a rough cot, his wrists bound, his face pale in the lantern glow. He was alive, though weak, his head turned toward the ceiling as though he longed for some glimpse of sky. The scar-faced man sat at a table, his knife idly spinning between his fingers while the bearded brute dozed near the door. Holmes drew back, his eyes alight with grim determination. "He lives," he whispered. "But we cannot strike tonight, not without arms and aid. To attempt it now would doom him as surely as ourselves. We must withdraw, plan and return with advantage." Reluctantly, we crept back into the darkness, the image of Pierce's pale face burning in my mind. Once safe among the trees, Holmes spoke again, his voice low and controlled. "Watson, we now possess certainty. Pierce is alive, his captors revealed. But the true mind behind this plot, the hand directing them, remains hidden. These men are but agents. We must free Pierce, yes, but we must also uncover the greater web. Otherwise, others will replace them and the fraud will continue." Sleep came little to me that night. The vision of the captive heir haunted me, as did the knowledge that every hour wasted increased his peril. Yet Holmes's resolve never wavered. He sat by the embers, his face unreadable, his mind turning ceaselessly. At dawn, he roused us. "We move carefully now," he said. "I intend to free Pierce within 2 nights, but we must first sow confusion, separate the captors, and ensure no reinforcements arrive. Harris, you will aid us with knowledge of the trails. Watson, your revolver must be kept close at hand. This game has shifted from pursuit to confrontation." As the first light of day touched the peaks, we began to prepare. Holmes's every movement was deliberate, his thoughts already several steps ahead. I knew then that the final act of this mountain pursuit was drawing near, and that within the shadowed pines and lonely cabins of the Rockies, the fate of Jonathan Pierce, and perhaps our own, would soon be decided. The morning dawned crisp and bright, the chill of the mountain air biting at my cheeks as the sun's rays struggled to warm the frost that clung to the pines. Yet despite the clear skies, the mood among us was one of heavy anticipation. Holmes had not slept, or if he had, it was no more than a fleeting doze with his back against a tree trunk and his mind ever turning. When I rose, stiff and weary, I found him already pacing a narrow line in the pine needles, his gaze fixed inward upon some chain of reasoning only he could follow. "Watson," he said without preamble, "today we set the board. Tomorrow we make our move." There was a stillness in his voice that carried more weight than any flourish of excitement. Harris crouched nearby as he cleaned his rifle, looked up sharply. "You mean to strike at the cabin?" Holmes inclined his head, in time. "But rashness is the ally of the fool, and we cannot afford folly when the stakes are a man's life and a conspiracy's exposure. These men, Scarface and his bearded comrade, are ruthless but not intelligent. They act under orders, of that I am certain. Their unseen master relies upon them to silence Pierce until matters are secured. If we merely storm in, we may succeed in rescuing the man, but we shall learn nothing of the greater hand that directs them. It is the master we must unmask." I felt a surge of frustration on Pierce's behalf, for the thought of his suffering gnawed at me. "Holmes, every hour he lies bound increases his torment. Can you truly justify delay?" My friend's gray eyes fixed upon me with unwavering calm. "It is precisely because of his plight that I must choose with care. Freeing him without unveiling the conspiracy leaves him forever vulnerable, for the fraud will persist and those behind it will not hesitate to strike again. Rescue and revelation must occur together, or neither will hold." His reasoning, though cold, could not be faulted. I bowed to his judgment, as I so often had, and devoted myself to the preparations. Harris guided us to a vantage point overlooking the trail that led down from the cabin, a narrow path winding like a serpent through the trees. From there we watched throughout the day, hidden in a thicket as the two ruffians went about their routine. The bearded man ventured forth twice, once with an empty sack that returned filled with provisions and once with a waterskin. The scar-faced man never left, his presence a sentinel within the cabin. Holmes noted each movement with clinical precision, marking the hours in his notebook. "They are cautious," he murmured, "yet even caution breeds patterns. And a pattern, Watson, is the very seam in armor that reason may pierce." As the afternoon wore on, Holmes signaled to Harris, who slipped away down a side trail and returned some hours later with a piece of intelligence that altered the complexion of our undertaking. "Word in the town yonder," Harris reported in a low voice, "is that a stranger came through a week back. A tall fellow with a fine coat and a manner of command. Didn't stay long, but he met with these two in secret, paid for supplies, and left word he'd return in a few days. Folks say he's English, though no one knows his name." Holmes's eyes lit faintly, though his expression remained grave. "Our master at last shows his shadow. A financier, I warrant. One who stands to lose the most if Pierce exposes their fraudulent minds. He cannot linger openly, for his name in Denver must carry weight. Instead, he employs hirelings to do his darker work." He turned to me, his hand tightening on my shoulder. "Watson, tomorrow night when the master comes, we shall be ready. It is not only Pierce we must free, but the villain we must ensnare. To let him slip back into society would be a crime against justice itself." That night passed in restless waiting, each hour dragging like an age. I lay upon the cold earth, my revolver close to hand, my thoughts torn between dread and anticipation. Holmes remained wakeful as ever, his silhouette still and unwavering against the dim glow of the embers. From time to time he hummed softly, a habit I had seen in him only when his mind raced along paths of unusual intensity. At last, the following afternoon, as the shadows lengthened across the peaks, a faint sound reached our ears, the rhythmic clop of hooves upon the stony trail. We concealed ourselves among the brush, scarcely daring to breathe. Soon a rider appeared, a tall man in a dark coat astride a bay horse, his posture erect, his movements deliberate. Though I could see but little of his face at that distance, his bearing bespoke wealth and authority, the very air of command Holmes had foretold. The rider dismounted before the cabin, tethered his horse, and entered. From our vantage point we could see little within, but soon a murmur of voices rose, at times sharp, at times low and insistent. Holmes placed his ear to the earth once more, catching vibrations I could scarcely discern. "They argue," he whispered. "The master is displeased. Pierce resists him still. Good. Resistance is our ally, for it forces haste, and haste breeds error." Night fell swiftly. The lantern within the cabin burned bright, and shadows of figures played against the log walls. Holmes's plan, laid out to us in curt whispers, was as daring as it was perilous. Harris was to circle wide and spook the tethered horse, sending it crashing through the trees to draw the bearded man outside. Holmes and I would then approach from opposite sides, gaining the door while the scar-faced man and the master remained within. Harris would rejoin us in the confusion, and together we would seize the moment to overpower them. The signal came when Holmes raised his hand like a conductor preparing his orchestra. Harris vanished into the darkness, and moments later the startled shriek of the bay horse shattered the silence, followed by the crash of branches and the curse of the bearded man as he rushed outside. Holmes moved then with astonishing swiftness, gliding through the shadows until he reached the cabin wall. I mirrored his motion, heart pounding, revolver drawn. Within, we heard the scar-faced man curse his companion's absence, his boots scuffing against the floorboards as he turned. Then Holmes struck. With a sudden kick, he flung open the door, the lantern's light spilling into the night. In the same instant, I burst from the opposite side, revolver leveled. The scene froze for a breath. Pierce lay bound upon the cot, his eyes wide with shock and hope. The scar-faced ruffian reached instinctively for his pistol, but Holmes was upon him, knocking the weapon aside with the precision of a fencer. The two grappled fiercely, shadows locked in violent struggle. Meanwhile, the master himself rose from his chair, his face at last revealed in the lamplight. It was a face I knew, though from where I could not instantly recall. A high forehead, sharp nose, eyes that glittered with both intelligence and arrogance. He moved not to fight but to flee, darting toward a rear door. I fired a warning shot, the crack echoing through the cabin like thunder, halting him in his tracks. "You will not leave, sir," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "The game is over." The struggle ended as Holmes drove his adversary against the table, sending the knife clattering to the floor. Harris burst in then, rifle raised, the bearded brute behind him subdued and cursing. In the sudden silence that followed, only Pierce's ragged breathing filled the cabin. Holmes rose, his coat torn, a bruise darkening his cheek, but his eyes burned with fierce triumph. "Watson," he said, his voice low yet resonant, "we have them. The servant, the brute, and most precious of all, the master." I turned then to the captured figure of the Englishman, whose expression was not one of fear but of cold disdain. "You think this will hold me," he sneered, his accent refined, his tone contemptuous.
"Do you know who I am?"
"The courts will never touch me. You have meddled in affairs far beyond your comprehension." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "On the contrary, sir. It is you who have underestimated the reach of reason. Fraud leaves footprints as surely as men upon soft earth, and you have trod heavily indeed. Pierce's cipher, your hirelings, your secret meetings, each piece fits, and together they form a pattern no court may ignore." Pierce stirred then, his voice hoarse but resolute. "He speaks truth. This man, this so-called benefactor, was no partner but a parasite, weaving lies to bleed Denver's veins of gold. He sought my silence, but he shall have instead my testimony." The master's lips curled into a thin smile, but behind it I saw the flicker of unease. Harris bound the men firmly while Holmes cut Pierce free. As the young heir staggered to his feet, supported by my arm, he grasped Holmes's hand with a strength born of gratitude. "You have saved my life, sir," he whispered. "And more. You have preserved honor where it was near lost." Holmes only inclined his head, his face grave. "Not yet, Mr. Pierce. Tonight we have seized but the players. Tomorrow we must unmask the game in full. Until then, vigilance is our only safeguard." As we led our captives down the mountain trail beneath the cold gaze of the stars, I felt both relief and unease. Pierce was safe, yes, and the villain subdued, yet Holmes's words lingered in my mind, heavy as stone. The night's triumph was but a beginning, not an end, and the deeper currents of this conspiracy were yet to surface. The descent through the mountains was a grim and arduous march, the silence broken only by the crunch of boots upon the frozen ground, and the occasional curse of one of our bound captives. The stars above glittered sharp and cold, and the wind whispered among the trees like some unseen watchman. Pierce leaned heavily upon me as we went, his strength sapped by days of confinement, though his spirit burned bright in the steady resolve of his eyes. Holmes strode just ahead, his figure dark and lean, ever watchful, his gaze darting often to our prisoners. The scar-faced man trudged with a sullen sneer, his hands bound, his eyes darting at every opportunity for escape, while the bearded brute muttered oaths under his breath. The master, however, maintained a terrible composure. His bearing was not that of a defeated criminal, but of a man awaiting the chance to turn the tables, his silence filled with menace. More than once I felt the weight of his gaze upon me, as though he measured my very soul and found me wanting. We reached a clearing near a stream at dawn, where Holmes judged it safe to rest. Harris and I tethered the captives to a stout pine and built a small fire to fight the chill. Holmes wasted no time in turning the interlude to purpose. He drew forth his notebook and seated himself before the master, whose dark coat and fine features looked incongruous among the rough company. "Your name, sir," Holmes said quietly, "is not unknown to me. Though you have sought to conceal it, the pieces align too neatly for chance. You are Charles Redmayne, late of London, financier and speculator, whose ventures in South Africa were dogged by whispers of fraud. When the tide turned against you, you vanished abroad. And now here in Denver you play the same game upon another stage. You purchase barren claims, you salt them with stolen ore, and you entice men of standing such as Mr. Pierce to lend you credibility. But when Pierce discovered your deception, you turned to threats, then abduction, and at last to the brink of murder." At the name, Redmayne's lips curled into the faintest smile. "You have sharp eyes, Mr. Holmes. Yet sharp eyes do not pierce the veil of influence. Do you truly believe the word of an ailing heir and a meddling detective will undo me? In Denver, I am no nameless swindler. I am a man of means, of friends in high places. Your victory tonight will prove short-lived." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze piercing as a rapier's thrust. Power built upon fraud is no fortress, Redmayne. It crumbles the moment light falls upon it. And light, I assure you, is what I shall bring. The financier's smile faltered, though only for a moment. He shifted, chains clinking, and turned his gaze to Pierce, who sat shivering by the fire. Do you think they will believe you, Jonathan? You? The eccentric heir who consorted with miners and clerks, who sought truths best left buried? They will call you a fool, a dreamer, while I, he said, his voice rising with conviction, shall walk free. Pierce's face flushed with anger, but Holmes raised a hand to still him. You overplay your hand, Redmayne, for already your web begins to unravel. Your hirelings are in our custody, and they will talk. Men of their stamp always do, given sufficient pressure. The cipher in Pierce's possession names dates, places, transactions, and most damning of all, we have you here, caught in the very act of conspiring to silence him. That alone is enough to strip away your veneer. Redmayne's eyes narrowed, and for the first time his composure cracked. He turned away, staring into the fire, his jaw clenched. Holmes sat back, his expression unreadable. We march for Denver, he said at last. There the matter will pass from the mountains to the courts. But mark me, Watson, our task is not yet done. We must guard Pierce with vigilance, for these men are but a limb of the greater body, and others may strike to sever his tongue before justice is served. The words proved prophetic sooner than I wished. That night, as we made camp on the lower slopes, a strange unease settled upon us. Harris, ever alert, kept watch along the trail, yet near midnight a faint whistle cut through the darkness, too precise, too deliberate to be the wind. Harris sprang to his feet, rifle raised, and in the next instant a shot cracked from the trees. The bullet struck sparks from a rock not 3 feet from Holmes. Chaos followed. Harris fired into the shadows, and we heard a cry of pain. The captives struggled against their bonds, the scar-faced man snarling like a beast. I pulled Pierce to the ground, shielding him as more shots rang out. Holmes moved with calm precision, seizing the bearded brute and wrenching him back as he tried to free himself. Within moments, Harris returned, dragging a wounded stranger by the arm. The man's face was rough and unfamiliar, his accent when he cursed marking him as a local. Another of Redmayne's allies, Holmes said grimly. They knew of his meeting and came to free him. Our window narrows, Watson. The longer we linger, the more the enemy gathers. By dawn we pressed on, our party wearier, our nerves frayed, yet our resolve hardening. Pierce, though weakened, walked with firmer step, his eyes alight with determination. Redmayne's silence had grown heavier, his arrogance less certain. More than once I saw him studying Holmes with a look that mingled hatred and reluctant admiration. 2 days later we reached the outskirts of Denver, the mountains receding behind us like the closing of a dark chapter. Holmes wasted no time in securing Pierce's safety. He placed him under guard in a discreet lodging, away from curious eyes, and dispatched Harris to alert the authorities. Redmayne and his men, still bound, were confined in a secure outbuilding, watched over with stern vigilance. Yet Holmes himself seemed restless, prowling the room with the air of a hound that scents the fox but has yet to corner it. At last he spoke. Watson, we stand upon the cusp, but the danger is greatest now. Redmayne is clever. He will have woven his influence deep into this city. If we rely only upon the local powers, he may yet slip the noose. We must move swiftly and with precision to lay bare the full scope of his fraud. The cipher must be decoded in full, the connections laid clear so that even his friends cannot deny them. That night, in the lamplight of the small lodging, Holmes bent once more to the cipher. For hours he worked, muttering, scribbling notes, shifting letters and numbers in patterns that eluded me utterly. At last, near dawn, he pushed back his chair with a weary smile. It is done, he said softly. The cipher reveals records of falsified assays, shipments of ore stolen from legitimate claims, and payments funneled through shell companies to enrich Redmayne's ventures. Every figure, every date. Pierce was meticulous. With this, the case is ironclad. I felt relief wash over me, yet Holmes's expression sobered as he added, but the danger, too, is doubled. For if Redmayne learns I have solved it, he will stop at nothing to silence us before the dawn. We must be vigilant, Watson. Tonight, the hunter may yet become the hunted. Even as he spoke, I felt the weight of the night pressing in upon us. The knowledge that though we had reached the city, the conspiracy's shadow loomed close. The game was not yet won, but the pieces had fallen into alignment, and I knew that the coming hours would bring the contest to its fiercest pitch. The day that followed our arrival in Denver passed in a kind of tense half-light, as though the city itself stood poised between revelation and ruin. Holmes was in constant motion, conferring with Pierce, sending Harris with discreet messages, and securing the assistance of 2 officers whom he deemed incorruptible. Yet for all his activity, I sensed that he held the true heart of his plan close, as though the scheme were too delicate to risk by the mere act of voicing it aloud. Pierce, though still pale from his ordeal, grew steadier in resolve. He spoke little, conserving his strength, but when he did, his words carried the weight of a man who had seen his very existence teeter upon the brink and had resolved not to let the opportunity for justice slip away. Redmayne, meanwhile, remained outwardly calm, though the iron set of his jaw betrayed a gnawing fury beneath. His hirelings had been secured in a separate cell, but it was plain to me that the financier believed his influence in Denver would soon turn the tables once again. Holmes's restlessness only increased as the hours crept forward. He spent long stretches pacing before the window of our lodging, the city noises drifting faintly up from the street below. Once I ventured to ask what troubled him, for it seemed to me we had in our possession the cipher, the captive villains, and the testimony of Pierce himself. "My dear Watson," he said, halting abruptly, "do you not see that possession is not victory? A man like Redmayne survives by the very air of doubt. If one influential voice can be persuaded to dismiss Pierce as an eccentric, or the cipher as fabrication, the entire edifice of truth may collapse before it reaches the courts. We must strike with such force, such clarity, that no whisper of uncertainty may cling to the case. For that reason, I have arranged for a gathering tonight at the offices of Judge Willoughby. Redmayne's allies will be present, as will those whose fortunes are entwined with his. In their very presence the truth shall be unveiled." The boldness of the plan startled me. "Holmes, you mean to confront them directly, while the man still breathes free air?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with the fire of a chess master at the brink of checkmate. "Exactly so. There is no stronger trap than one into which the quarry walks believing himself the hunter." Evening fell swiftly. A carriage carried us through the gaslit streets to the courthouse district, its lamps casting pale halos upon the cobbles. Pierce sat opposite me, his hands clasped tightly, his jaw set. Holmes was silent throughout, his gaze fixed upon the bundle of documents in his lap. The cipher, now fully deciphered, annotated in his own sharp hand. Redmayne, under heavy guard, was conveyed separately, his presence a necessary keystone to the confrontation. Judge Willoughby's chambers were a lofty room paneled in dark oak, the air heavy with tobacco smoke and the faint scent of paper and ink. A dozen men were gathered within, their faces stern and wary. Among them were mine owners, city officials, and financiers, their expressions betraying unease at the spectacle. Holmes entered with the quiet authority of a man who knew his ground, and for a moment even the restless murmuring ceased. Redmayne was brought forward, unshackled but flanked by guards, his composure intact, his eyes glittering with cold disdain. "This charade," he said smoothly, "is unworthy of men of standing. To drag me here under the word of an unbalanced air and a foreign meddler is an insult. I demand my release at once." Holmes inclined his head, his manner courteous but unyielding. "All in good time, Mr. Redmayne. First, permit me to lay before this company the substance of the charge." He spread the documents across the table, his long fingers dancing over them as though upon the keys of an instrument. "This cipher, found in the possession of Jonathan Pierce, records in meticulous detail the falsification of mining assays, the theft of ore, and the laundering of profits through a web of companies all traceable to Mr. Redmayne. Each figure corresponds precisely to dates and shipments corroborated by independent records. Gentlemen, what lies before you is not conjecture but fact as certain as arithmetic." Murmurs rose, some incredulous, some angry, others fearful. Redmayne's lips thinned. "Fabrications," he hissed. "The ravings of a weak young man manipulated by your theatrics, Holmes. I have invested more than any in the prosperity of this city. Do you think these men will abandon me for the word of one whose mind is as fragile as glass?" Holmes turned, his gaze steady upon Pierce. Then let the man speak for himself. Pierce stepped forward, his voice low but clear, carrying the conviction of one who had endured the worst. "Gentlemen, I have no wish for wealth born of lies. I trusted Redmayne with my name and my fortune, and he betrayed both. When I uncovered his schemes, he sought not to answer, but to silence me. You see me now only because I was plucked from the brink of death by these men. If you doubt my word, look upon the cipher I wrote, upon the figures I traced in my own hand. Judge me by that, not by Redmayne's honeyed falsehoods. A heavy silence followed. Even those who had entered as Redmayne's allies shifted uneasily. It was Holmes who broke the spell, his voice sharp as a whip. But let us not rest upon words alone. Allow me to call a witness. At his signal, Harris entered, escorting the scar-faced man whose defiance had crumbled under Holmes's relentless questioning. His face was pale, his eyes downcast. "Speak," Holmes commanded. The man's voice was a rasp. "It's true. We salted the mines. We swapped the ore, just like he said. Redmayne paid us, threatened us if we talked. We took Pierce to the mountains when he wouldn't stay bought. That's the truth of it." The chamber erupted in shouts and exclamations. Several men surged to their feet, some denouncing Redmayne, others demanding order. Judge Willoughby pounded the table for silence, his face grave. Redmayne himself stood rigid, his hands trembling with fury. "Lies, bought testimony, nothing more. Do you not see the trick? Holmes weaves illusions, and you dance to his tune like puppets." Holmes's eyes were alight with the fire of triumph. "If this is illusion, Redmayne, then it is one built upon the bedrock of fact. You are undone, sir, not by my words but by your own actions. The cipher, the testimony, the very pattern of your dealings, they form a chain no man may break." For the first time, Redmayne's mask shattered. His face twisted with rage, and with a sudden, desperate motion, he lunged toward the table, his hand snatching for the documents. But Holmes was faster. In one fluid movement, he intercepted him, forcing him back with a strength born of certainty. Guards rushed forward, seizing Redmayne as he struggled like a trapped beast. The room, once a cacophony of voices, fell into awed silence. Holmes gathered the scattered papers, smoothing them with calm precision. He turned to the assembly, his voice steady, almost quiet. "Gentlemen, you have seen with your own eyes the truth. Whatever friendships, whatever investments may have bound you to Redmayne, the law is plain. Fraud and conspiracy stand here exposed. Let justice now take its course." Judge Willoughby rose, his expression grave. "Mr. Holmes, Mr. Pierce, your courage has preserved this city from a cancer that might have devoured it whole. I shall see that the law does not falter." As Redmayne was led away, his fury giving way at last to despair, I caught Holmes's eye. For a moment I glimpsed the weariness beneath his triumph, the toll of days without rest, of constant vigilance and ceaseless calculation. Yet there was also satisfaction, the deep satisfaction of a man whose reason had prevailed over deceit. That night, as we returned to our lodging, Pierce spoke with quiet emotion. "Holmes, I can never repay what you have done. You have given me not only my life but the chance to reclaim honor where I thought it lost." Holmes regarded him with that rare gentleness he reserved for those who had endured much. "Your courage, Mr. Pierce, was the keystone. Without it, my reasoning would have been but dust. Remember that." As Pierce turned away, overcome, Holmes settled into his chair by the window, his silhouette etched against the glow of the city beyond. He lit his pipe and exhaled a thin plume of smoke, his eyes distant. "Another case closed, Watson," he murmured. "Yet how swiftly men of wealth forget that truth, though buried, always rises. Fraud is but shadow, and shadow cannot withstand the light." I said nothing, for I knew well that behind those calm words lay the fierce joy of victory, and the restless mind already seeking the next puzzle upon which to turn its inexhaustible energies. The following morning dawned pale and chill, the Denver streets still cloaked in a quiet that seemed to hang after the storm of the night before. I rose early, for sleep had been a fickle companion. The events of the confrontation in Judge Willoughby's chambers replayed themselves in my mind with such vividness that rest came only in broken intervals. When I descended to the small dining room of our lodgings, I found Holmes already seated, a thin ribbon of smoke curling from his pipe, his gaze fixed upon the city beyond the window. "You are up early," I remarked, settling beside him. "I have not been to bed at all," he replied in that cool, matter-of-fact tone of his. The mind, once engaged in so intricate a case, does not so easily accept repose. Besides, I had certain matters to arrange before our return to England. "Return?" I exclaimed. "Surely we must remain for the trial. After all we have endured, it would seem incomplete to depart now." Holmes turned his head slightly, the faintest suggestion of a smile upon his lips. "Watson, my work is in the hunt, not in the harvest. The law will do its part, and I have no doubt Redmayne's conviction is secured. But the mind grows restless when idle. Already the scent of another problem has reached me, a curious cable from London that arrived in the night. You will forgive me if my thoughts stray from the gallows to the game board. Though I longed to press him further, I knew from experience that Holmes divulged his intentions only when the moment suited him. Instead, I shifted the subject to Pierce, whose resilience through the ordeal had stirred my admiration. "He is recovering steadily," Holmes said, reading my thoughts before I voiced them. "The ordeal has burned away a certain naivety, yet left him stronger. Adversity often acts as the crucible of character. He will be wiser now, though the scars may linger." Indeed, Pierce joined us shortly thereafter, his manner steadier than I had yet seen it. He greeted us with warmth, though his eyes betrayed a lingering shadow of the trauma he had endured. "Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said with quiet resolve, "I wish to see you before the trial begins. No matter what transpires, I owe my life to you both. If ever I can repay such a debt, my fortune and friendship are yours." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Your gratitude is unnecessary, Mr. Pierce. You have already repaid me, though you may not realize it." Pierce frowned slightly. "How so?" "By showing courage when it was most needed. Without your testimony, without your willingness to confront the specter of Redmayne's deceit, all my reasoning would have been mere smoke. You supplied the truth, sir. I merely cleared the fog from around it." Pierce seemed deeply moved. Yet Holmes had already turned back to the window, his interest in compliments as fleeting as the wisp of smoke that drifted from his pipe. News of the previous night's revelations spread quickly through Denver, carried upon the tongues of newspapermen and whispered in the corridors of power. By noon, the headlines proclaimed Redmayne's fall with unrestrained fervor. Some papers painted Holmes as a near-mythical figure who had outwitted corruption. Others lamented the stain upon the city's reputation. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, eager to catch a glimpse of the disgraced financier as he was escorted under heavy guard. I accompanied Holmes there, though he held little interest in the spectacle. He observed the throngs with a detached air, his sharp eyes noting details that escaped others. "See there, Watson," he murmured, nodding toward a cluster of men who stood apart from the crowd. "Associates of Redmayne. Observe how they watch not him but one another. They fear that tongues may loosen, that secrets long buried may surface now that their champion has fallen. One collapse often brings down an entire edifice." He was right. Within hours, additional confessions emerged, lesser conspirators seeking leniency by offering testimony against their master. The web Holmes had revealed was unraveling strand by strand, and Denver's high society trembled at the revelations. That evening, as the trial preparations commenced, Holmes and I returned once more to Judge Willoughby's chambers. The judge, grave and dignified, thanked Holmes in words of such sincerity that even my companion appeared momentarily touched. "Mr. Holmes," said Willoughby, "Denver owes you a debt beyond calculation. Without your intervention, this city might have been wholly consumed by deceit. Should you ever return, you will find the gates of justice here open to you." Holmes bowed slightly, then replied in his calm, measured way, "I am gratified, Judge, though I ask only that truth be pursued with diligence, whether I stand in Denver or London. The measure of a city lies not in its wealth but in its fidelity to justice." As we departed, I could not help but marvel at the quiet authority with which Holmes had delivered those words. He who so often seemed aloof from sentiment could, when the moment demanded, speak with a gravity that stirred the hearts of even the most hardened men. 2 days later, Redmayne's trial commenced. Though Holmes insisted that our presence was unnecessary, I remained determined to witness the outcome. The prosecution's case was ironclad, fortified by the cipher, the testimony of Pierce, and the confessions of Redmayne's hirelings. Redmayne himself maintained an unyielding defiance, yet I saw in his eyes the growing shadow of despair as each damning fact was laid bare. Holmes, meanwhile, sat in silence beside me, scarcely glancing toward the proceedings. His mind, I knew, had already moved beyond the courtroom, pursuing new trails invisible to all but himself. When at last the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, with sentencing to follow, Holmes merely inclined his head, as though acknowledging a move long foreseen upon a chessboard. That evening, Pierce dined with us one final time before our departure. He spoke with gratitude, with relief, and with the faint glimmer of hope for the future. "My fortune may yet be restored," he said, "but more than that, I am resolved to use it rightly. Denver must rise again, cleansed of this corruption." Holmes lifted his glass in a rare gesture of camaraderie. "Then may your future be brighter than your past, Mr. Pierce." You have endured the crucible and emerged tempered. The following morning, we boarded the train eastward, the great mountains of Colorado receding slowly into the distance. Holmes sat opposite me, his lean figure relaxed at last, though his eyes retained that restless glimmer which spoke of untold calculations within. As the rhythm of the train carried us onward, I ventured to ask, "Holmes, what cable was it you received from London? You hinted at a new problem, yet you have said nothing since." He regarded me with that familiar, half-amused expression that so often preceded the unveiling of some fresh enigma. "Ah, Watson, ever the faithful chronicler, very well. The cable concerned the disappearance of an antiquarian in Whitechapel, under circumstances most curious. An empty safe, a vanished manuscript, and a locked room without a key. It seems that London has grown impatient for my return. And you intend to take the case?" "Of course. What is life, Watson, without its puzzles? The mind that ceases to pursue them stagnates, and stagnation is death. Besides," he added, leaning back as the faintest smile touched his lips, "after Denver, a locked room in Whitechapel will seem but a pleasant diversion." I could not help but laugh, though I knew well that this was no mere jest. For Sherlock Holmes, life was indeed an unending series of mysteries, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of human intrigue, and as the train bore us homeward I felt once more that familiar sense of anticipation, that wherever Holmes turned his gaze, there would follow adventure, peril, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Thus ended our sojourn in Denver, a chapter marked by danger, deceit, and the triumph of reason over corruption. Yet even as the city faded into the distance, I knew that this was but one story among many, that the chronicles of Sherlock Holmes would continue, each case a testament to the brilliance of his mind and the unyielding light of truth in the darkest of places.